I'm reading I Promessi Sposi. It's one of the best books you'll ever read. Set in 17th century Italy, it's the tale of how Lorenzo Tramaglino and Lucia Mondella, with the help of their friend, the friar Cristoforo, overcome every single obstacle between them. It's a beautiful story of hope and faith. It's a story of love. It's a romance. It's also written in a Romance language. But why do we do that? Why do we use the same noun and adjective to refer to a literary genre and a family of languages? Well, that's what we're going to discuss today. So let me start by jettisoning the most common misconception. No, Romance languages are not called Romance languages because they are at all considered romantic. In fact, that kind of perception is much more recent than you might think. For example, RobWords has an excellent video on how German was considered much more romantic, much more beautiful than many of the Romance languages before World War II. So no, that's not the reason at all. To understand this, though, we need to look at medieval literature. Look at these titles. The Romancero Viejo from Spain, Il Romanzo di Alessandro in Italian, the Portuguese Romance du Senhor Rei Dom Pedro, the Roman de la Rose in French. They're medieval works. They've got romance in the title, but they don't have romance in the content if you actually read them. Well, then what are all these different variations of the word romance designating if they don't mean romance in our modern sense? Why are they in these titles? To understand that, we need to consider two important pre-modern literary conventions. The first is that if you were writing something that we might consider analytical today, something that's like a bit of an essay, a treatise on politics, philosophy, theology, history, those would usually be in prose. Poetry was reserved for fiction, and in fact, up until after the publication of Don Quixote, poetry and fiction were pretty much synonymous words. I'm cutting in here quickly to say this is actually why Aristotle's Poetics is called the Poetics. It's not about poetry, it's about fiction in general, in this case specifically tragedy. If you're interested in understanding the theory behind fiction, it's a great book to actually read. So that's the first important convention. The second important convention to keep in mind is that those formal works that were meant for an educated audience, works that were meant to be, if I may simplify things, taken seriously, were usually written in Latin. That was the universal scientific language up until pretty recently, up until well into the 1700s. Inversely, if you wanted your work to appeal to a more popular audience, you might want to write it in the vernacular tongue. You might want to write it in the languages that are descendant from Latin, the Romance languages. And in fact, that's where the word romance comes from, of or having to do with the Romans. Not Latin, but Romance. And that's why you see that word in the titles of all the works that I mentioned earlier on. They're not referring to content in the poems or books that we're discussing. They're referring to the language that those are written in. Those were called romances because they were written in earlier forms of French, Spanish, Portuguese, etc., what have you. But that leaves open one question. Why do we use this word to talk about a literary genre? The answer there, again, lies in history, and I can't answer this without engaging in a degree of historiographical speculation, but I will say that it's historiographical speculation that is pretty well founded on quite strong scholarship. This all lies with the Romantics. Now, the 19th and 18th centuries saw the rise of artists, poets, writers who were somewhat disillusioned with the state of the world as it was. A world that seemed to indicate that the intrinsic meaning central to the universe, taken for granted in the medieval, Renaissance and Baroque worldview, was being broken down. The universe didn't care about you anymore. The universe didn't have any meaning that you simply had to go out and find. And these poets, faced with this dilemma, started to argue that you didn't find meaning, you made meaning. Meaning was made by imposing yourself on your environment. In a search for finding out how they could make meaning in their lives, these poets did what a lot of us do. They looked to the distant past. They looked to medieval chivalric romances, the stories of King Arthur and Guinevere, the Knights of the Round Table, Amadis de Gaula, and all those other super famous fictional characters from centuries past. They decided to model their movement on those works of literature and consequently labeled themselves romantics, identifying themselves with the literature of centuries past. And that's how we got the association between modern fictional romance and this word that initially just referred to a language that was descendant of the language spoken by the Romans. Now, I hope you enjoyed that video. If there were any gaps in my description, please correct me and fill them in the comments below. I sometimes forget things when I speak in person. I'm going to leave some useful video clips below that explain the rise of Romanticism as best as I can understand it. I hope that you get a chance to look at those because they're extremely informative. I enjoyed making this video a lot, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.